"You don't belong in first class," Heather Langston snapped, tearing a perfectly valid boarding pass straight down the middle as if it were trash. Her eyes locked onto a man dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, unaware that in less than 30 minutes, he would fire her in front of a full cabin of stunned passengers, flight staff, and social media cameras already rolling. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the collapse of everything Starglide Air tried to hide. And that man, he wasn't just any passenger. He was Julian Matthews, CEO, billionaire, and 25% owner of the airline she just humiliated. Before we delve into what happened on June 20th inside Gate A26, if you're interested in the full breakdown of injustice, redemption, and a moment that changed U.S. aviation history, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below on where you're viewing from. What would you have done in Julian's shoes? Let's get into it. The flight was scheduled to leave San Diego for New York at exactly 6:23 p.m. Pacific time. Pre-boarding had just started. The first-class cabin was quiet, plush, and cool. Everything that typical premium comfort advertisements promised. That's when Julian walked in, calm and collected, unnoticed as he had planned. See, Julian Matthews wasn't just traveling to New York. He was investigating his own airline. A series of online reviews had accumulated, mostly ignored by PR, about how Starglide staff treated passengers based on their appearances, not race outright, but clothing and vibes, you know the type. So Julian dressed down, wearing no Rolex, no suit, no entourage. Just jeans, sneakers, and a black t-shirt. First-class seat 2A was paid in full, booked under his real name with no favors involved. But when he approached his seat, Heather Langston, a 35-year-old flight attendant from Nevada, looked him up and down as if he was lost. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong cabin," she said flatly. Julian showed his boarding pass, yet Heather didn't even glance at it. "That seat has been reassigned," she added, already motioning toward the economy section. Troy Mason, another flight attendant, younger and smoked from Texas, walked up and chuckled. "Yeah, man, you sure you're in the right place? Looks like economy is more your style." Julian raised an eyebrow but kept his cool. "This says 2A, first class." He handed over both his boarding pass and his ID, a clean California driver's license. Heather barely looked at it. "This has to be fake. We've seen this before. Just last month in Denver," she scoffed, referring to a 2020 incident where another black passenger was told the same thing. Captain Eli Ford, tall and stern, walked down from the cockpit, summoned by Heather. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to remove you. We have VIP guests who need that seat," he said, already motioning behind him. That's when Stephen and Amanda Whitmore, a wealthy white couple, stepped forward holding champagne flutes and flashing platinum medallion tags. Stephen said, "Is this going to be a problem?" Heather replied, "We're handling it." The Whitmore smiled, clearly having arranged the seat reassignment ahead of time. Julian remained seated, calm but firm. "I'm not moving." That's when Natalie Cruz, the security officer on site, in her mid-30s and born and raised in California, stepped in with her hand on her utility belt. "Sir, I'm giving you one warning. Either vacate the seat or you'll be escorted off." A few rows back, Zoe Tran, a 22-year-old trainee flight attendant on her first solo assignment, looked stunned. She hesitated before stepping up. Actually, I think his ticket's real. I saw it scan green." Heather snapped. "Stay out of this, Zoe." Zoe stepped back, but not before tapping her phone's audio recorder and slipping it into her jacket pocket. In row 4, 2 white passengers clearly watching everything looked horrified. Vanessa Doyle, 38 from Oregon, pulled out her phone and hit record. "This is discrimination," she muttered. Her seatmate, Patrick Neal, 42 from Georgia, nodded. "This is going to blow up. Watch." He started filming too. Heather, now visibly irritated, grabbed Julian's boarding pass and tore it down the middle. "You're going to economy or you're off." Julian blinked. "Excuse me." She turned to Natalie. "Get him out." Julian pulled out his platinum business card, a thick matte black slab with his full name engraved on it. Heather laughed. "You people carry fake cards now?" she asked loud enough for others to hear. Captain Eli frowned. "You've been warned." Julian, still composed, pulled out his phone and called Rachel Monroe, his executive assistant. "Rachel, log this. Contact the board. Tell them we're about to have a situation." Rachel answered instantly. "Already on it. Sending alerts now." Meanwhile, the Whitmore stepped into seat 2A like royalty, sitting down where Julian should have been and brushing him off as if he were invisible. Vanessa shook her head. "This is so wrong." She uploaded her video to X and TikTok with the hashtag #StarlightShock. Within seconds, views ticked upward. Patrick followed by posting from a different angle. "This is disgusting," he said on camera. Back in the galley, Zoe overheard Heather and Troy whispering. "Dude really thought he was flying first class." Troy laughed. "He probably printed that boarding pass at home," Heather added. "Not in those jeans, honey." Zoe pressed record on her voice memo app again. She looked sick to her stomach. Back in the cabin, Captain Eli walked up again. "Last warning." Julian stood, not to leave but to face them. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You have no idea who I am." Heather rolled her eyes. "You're nobody. Economy's that way." Vanessa stood up. "He's got a valid ticket. I saw it." Patrick joined her. "You can't just take someone's seat because of what they look like." Passengers murmured. Natalie stepped forward. "Sir, move now." Julian didn't budge. He looked straight at Captain Eli. "You're going to regret this." Eli scoffed. Threat noted. From the galley, Zoe reappeared. Cheeks flushed. "Captain, I really think you need to listen. He belongs here." Eli waved her off. "Trainees don't speak during escalation." Heather, still fuming, smirked. "See, even your own staff knows you're lying." Vanessa raised her phone again. "The internet's watching," she said. Her voice cut through the air from the back. Someone whispered, "Is this that guy? The billionaire guy?" Another muttered, "What billionaire?" But before the rumors could spread, Heather returned to her iPad and typed something fast. She opened the seating log and deleted Julian's name. "There," she muttered to Troy. "No record of Matthews ever booking 2A. Troy chuckled. Problem solved. Zoe overheard it all. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Julian sat back down, not in defeat but in defiance. "You're ruining this company," he said. Heather scoffed. "It's not your company." Julian's jaw tightened. "Want to bet?" The camera panned back to Vanessa, who whispered into her phone's mic, "Something's about to go down." Captain Eli's voice turned sharp, cutting through the cabin like static on a bad radio. "Sir, this is your final notice. Leave first class or be removed." Julian didn't flinch. He stayed in his seat, calm but unshakable, like someone who had seen this game played 100 times. Heather, standing to the side with arms crossed and lip curled, muttered to Troy loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "He's a scammer, just like that guy in Atlanta last year who said he had a ticket." Troy chuckled and added, "Yeah, I've had enough of people trying to dress it up and sneak into seats they didn't pay for. Policy is policy." That word policy hung heavy in the air like a loaded weapon. Julian looked around the cabin. The Whitmores were now comfortably sipping wine in seat 2A. His seat, as if they hadn't just been part of a silent theft. Then came Natalie again, the security officer, stepping forward with slow, practiced authority. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she warned. "You don't want to end up on a no-fly list over this." Zoe Tran, still near the galley, looked over with wide eyes. "But his scan was green," she repeated as if that should matter. But it didn't. Not to Heather, not to Troy, and clearly not to Captain Eli Ford. Julian exhaled and muttered, "So this is how you treat people who don't fit your image of first class." He pulled out his phone again, speaking just loud enough. "Rachel, send the audio to James, Sarah, and David. Tell them it's time." On the other end, Rachel Monroe, crisp and focused, replied, "Already done. The board's aware." Heather overheard and rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Recording us for what, YouTube?" Troy laughed under his breath. Maybe he'll go viral before we toss him off. Nearby, Vanessa Doyle stood halfway up in her seat filming again. This is wrong. The man hasn't raised his voice once. Why are you treating him like a threat? Patrick Neal nodded, holding his phone. Exactly. They'll keep saying policy but won't even look at his ID. Eli turned toward the passengers, eyes narrowing. This passenger is interfering with pre-flight protocols. He's refusing staff instructions. We're following FAA guidelines. That phrase, FAA guidelines, made a few other passengers sit back down, unsure of what to believe. But Vanessa wasn't having it. He showed you everything. You tore up his ticket and lied about the system. Heather snapped back. There is no record of a Julian Matthews in seat 2A. In the galley, Zoe's fingers trembled around her phone. She had just recorded Heather and Troy mocking Julian again, saying, "Dude probably borrowed those jeans from Goodwill." And now she watched as the seating log on Heather's tablet showed a suspicious blank spot where Julian's name had once been. The log was altered. She saw it with her own eyes. This wasn't just a mistake. It was targeted, and it was ugly. Then the cabin turned quiet for a moment. That kind of uneasy quiet before something shifts. One row back, a teenager whispered to his mom, "He's not doing anything wrong." The mom nodded quietly, pulling out her phone too. Meanwhile, Julian leaned back and thought about 20 years earlier when he was just 25. Fresh out of grad school, applying for a job at a regional airline. He showed up in slacks and a button-down and still got rejected. The manager said, "Not the image we're looking for." That phrase stuck with him for decades. And here it was again, different faces, same energy. Not the image. That rejection became fuel for every deal, every late night, every stake he'd built until he held 25% of Starglide Air. And now he was here, being treated like trash on a plane he partially owned. Rachel's voice came through again, calm and razor-sharp. "James is standing by. Sarah's reviewing the seating log. David is pulling all incident reports from this month." Julian replied, "Tell them Zoe has audio." Zoe looked up at the mention of her name. She stepped forward slowly. "Captain, I recorded what Heather and Troy said. I think the board should hear it." Eli turned red. "That's a violation of crew protocol." Zoe didn't back down. "So is what they did." Heather laughed, clearly shaken but still snide. "Oh please, no one's going to believe a trainee. You don't even have wings yet." Vanessa raised her phone again. "I do. I believe her." Patrick added, "Same here." Then someone from the back yelled, "Us too." Momentum shifted. It wasn't just Julian anymore. It was everyone. Captain Eli raised his voice. "This situation is escalating because of one non-compliant passenger." Natalie stepped forward again, her stance more aggressive now. "Sir, this is your final warning. You'll be removed." Julian didn't move. He locked eyes with Natalie. "I suggest you wait about 5 more minutes." She frowned. "Why?" Julian's voice dropped low. "Because by then you'll be getting a call from someone who signs your paychecks." Vanessa looked at Patrick, then back at Julian. "Who are you?" Julian didn't answer yet. Not yet, not until it mattered. Natalie's hand twitched at her radio. But before she could call it in, Zoe stepped fully into the aisle. "This is wrong," she said, voice shaking but firm. "His ticket scanned green. I watched it. I double-checked." Heather rolled her eyes again. "He's probably scamming the whole system. You think we don't get fake tickets every week?" Julian turned to Heather slowly. "You're talking to someone who's flown on this airline longer than you've worked here." Troy leaned against the galley wall, trying to stay cool. "Then you should know the rules." Vanessa scoffed. "He does know the rules better than you." Then Patrick said it loud and clear. "You're going to lose your jobs over this." That's when Heather panicked, whispering to Troy, "Do you think he's somebody?" Troy glanced at Julian's face, steady and unreadable. "He looks familiar." Heather's voice dropped. "Matthews? Wait, no, it can't be." Zoe looked from Heather to Julian, then back. Her eyes widened. Rachel's voice came in again, this time firmer. "They know who you are now. The board's ready. If they make one more move, give the signal." Julian's lips curved into a calm, cutting smile. "Let's give them that move, then." Just as Heather raised her hand to wave Natalie in again, Zoe stepped forward with her phone raised. "I have everything recorded, and I'll send it to the board if you try to remove him." Heather froze. Troy stepped back. Captain Eli cursed under his breath. Vanessa's video just passed 5,000 views. Patrick's wasn't far behind. The pressure was mounting. The cabin was tense. Julian stood slowly, not to leave but to command the space. "Your bias ends here." The cabin, once silent, erupted in murmurs of agreement. Passengers began standing with him, and just like that, a quiet man in a black t-shirt wasn't alone anymore. Captain Eli Ford's voice cracked through the intercom like a final blow to dignity. "Attention passengers. Due to a disruption in first class, we are asking all guests to remain seated as we remove a non-compliant individual refusing staff instructions." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Julian Matthews didn't blink. He was still seated, still calm, staring ahead while the walls of injustice closed in. Heather stood just behind Eli, smirking, as if the announcement sealed it. Troy lingered by the galley, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "That's it," Natalie muttered, stepping forward, hand resting near her radio. "We're doing this the hard way." She reached for Julian's arm. "Sir, stand up now." Julian turned his head slowly, voice low but cutting. "You put your hands on me, you'll answer to a boardroom, not a holding cell." She froze, not because she believed him, not yet, but because of the force in his tone. Across the aisle, Vanessa Doyle's phone didn't stop recording. "You see this," she said. "They're really going to drag him out for having a legit ticket." Her video, posted under the hashtag #StarglightShock, had already hit 95,000 views and climbing. "This is what racism looks like in 2025. Her caption read, 2 rows back. Patrick Neal posted a clip from a different angle, overlaying the words, "This man showed ID. He showed his ticket. They just didn't like how he looked." His video crossed 100,000 views just as Captain Eli finished his intercom message. Meanwhile, Zoe Tran, the young trainee flight attendant who had been quietly recording from the galley, stepped into the aisle, her nerves visibly shaking but her voice finding its spine. "Captain, please. I have proof." He was scanned in. His boarding pass was valid. I heard Heather say there was no record after she deleted it herself. Heather spun around, eyes wide. "Excuse me? That's a lie." Zoe didn't flinch. "You said it. You and Troy were laughing about it in the galley." Eli's face went pale. "You recorded the crew." Zoe nodded. "Sure did." Heather's smirk vanished. "That's illegal," Patrick yelled from his seat. "So is tearing up someone's ticket and lying about it." Passengers started murmuring, some standing up to see better. The pressure shifted quickly. What had started as one man being targeted was now a cabin full of witnesses. "They're trying to erase a paying customer." Someone muttered, "This is insane." Heather turned to Troy, her voice suddenly panicked. "We're losing control of the cabin." Troy muttered, "This is on you. You wanted to push him out." Vanessa took a bold step forward, raising her phone high. "Don't touch him. We're all watching, and we're not letting you drag him off this plane." Another passenger added, "You do that, and you'll be on the news by midnight." The human tide formed fast, a soft blockade of standing passengers holding phones, blocking Natalie and Eli from getting to Julian. He remained in his seat, calm, phone still in hand. "Rachel," he said, speaking into his AirPods, "tell James, Sarah, and David the situation's escalated. They need to hear this." Rachel's voice came back, sharp and unwavering. "I've already looped in the board. They're in emergency session now. Legal is reviewing the audio and video." Julian nodded slightly, his eyes meeting Natalie's. "If you remove me now, you remove your future with this airline." Captain Eli stepped in again, trying to assert authority. "You can't speak to my team that way." Julian replied, flat, "I'm speaking to them like someone who signs their payroll checks." Something shifted in the room. Heather blinked. "Wait, what?" Troy's face turned gray. "You're joking." Natalie hesitated, lowering her radio slightly. Julian said nothing more. Not yet, letting the weight of uncertainty hang in the air like storm clouds. From the galley, Zoe hit play on her phone. The voice memo echoed. Heather saying, "Not in those jeans." Troy laughing about fake tickets. And a short clip where Heather muttered, "Delete it. Matthew's name doesn't belong in first class anyway." Passengers gasped. Patrick said loudly, "That's it. That's all the proof you need." Vanessa added, "They deleted his name from the system. This was planned." Heather spun around, yelling. She edited that. She spliced it. But no one was listening to her anymore. Captain Eli's eyes darted between his crew and the crowd. "Everyone sit down," he started. But the passengers weren't budging. "You're not removing anyone," Patrick said. "We're staying right here." Natalie looked at Eli. "Captain, this isn't going how it's supposed to." "You think?" He snapped back. The power they thought they had was slipping fast, and they knew it. Heather was sweating now, visibly shaken. "Okay, fine," she said, flustered. "Maybe we misread the situation." Julian finally stood up, not to leave but to face them all. "No," he said. "You read it exactly how you wanted. You saw a black man in jeans and decided I didn't belong. You ripped up my ticket. You lied about my ID. You forged the log. You mocked me in the galley. All of it for optics." Heather opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Then from the other side of the cabin, a passenger, older, quiet until now, said, "This feels familiar. This happened to my son." Different city, same playbook. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Passengers weren't just reacting. They were remembering. "I've seen this," someone said. "Every time they claim policy, it's always the same." Zoe took a breath and stepped beside Julian. "He's telling the truth. I back him 100%. Eli raised his voice again. "This crew is trained to follow FAA protocol and to profile people." Julian cut in. "To target based on clothing, skin." No response. Julian nodded. "Right." Then his phone buzzed. Rachel's voice came into his earpiece. "They're ready." He didn't say anything else. He looked at Heather, then Troy, then Eli. "You'll want to sit down. You're about to be very unemployed." Heather stepped back. Wait, she whispered. Troy looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Captain Eli tried to gather what was left of his authority. "This is a misunderstanding." Julian stared him down. "You're going to wish it was." Vanessa's phone buzzed. "My video just hit 1 million views." Patrick checked his too. "Mine's at 130,000. Comments are exploding." The Whitmores, who had been silent in 2A, finally spoke. Stephen cleared his throat. "We didn't ask for this." Julian turned toward them. "But you didn't stop it either." Amanda lowered her gaze. "We thought. Staff knew best." "Staff lied," Julian replied. "And you benefited from it." The cabin was still now. The crew had no control. Julian had not yet revealed his identity, but he didn't need to. Not anymore. The power had already shifted. Captain Eli's jaw clenched as he turned from the passengers to Heather, Troy, and Natalie. "Enough," he snapped, eyes wild, voice unsteady. "Remove him now." Heather didn't hesitate. She stormed down the aisle with Troy on her left and Natalie stepping forward, hand hovering close to Julian's shoulder. "Sir, we're done playing games. You're coming with us," Natalie ordered, her voice louder than before, trying to mask her rising discomfort with authority. Julian didn't move. He simply looked down at his phone and tapped once. "Rachel," he said, calm as ever. "They're making their final move. Confirm board status." On the other end, Rachel's voice rang clear in his AirPods. "The board is live. All 3 members, James, Sarah, David, are online. They've reviewed the logs, the footage, and the audio. They're ready." Julian nodded once, then looked up just as Natalie reached for him. "Don't," he said, not loudly, but with a gravity that made her hesitate. "You're a single decision away from either saving your job or losing it forever." Natalie blinked. her hand frozen in the air. Behind them, passengers were no longer just filming. They were speaking out, some standing, some forming a loose blockade between Julian and the crew. "You're not taking him anywhere," Vanessa Doyle declared, her phone still raised. "You tore up his boarding pass. You mocked him. And now you want to throw him off the plane." Patrick Neal stood beside her, adding, "That's not security. That's abuse." Someone in row 5 shouted, "He paid for that seat. I saw him check in." Another voice added, "This is happening way too often." Heather shouted back, "Everyone stay seated, or you'll be removed too." But no one sat. Instead, more passengers stood up, creating a wall of resistance, shoulder to shoulder, holding phones, muttering to each other, some in anger, some in disbelief. Natalie's voice dropped into a whisper, leaning toward Eli. "This doesn't feel right anymore." Eli hissed, "Just follow orders." But she didn't move. Instead, her eyes shifted from Julian to Zoe, who was standing across the aisle, holding her phone tightly against her chest, the screen glowing with the voice memo app still running. Zoe stepped forward, her voice cracking at first but gaining strength. "I heard Heather and Troy in the galley. They joked about how Julian didn't belong here and said they'd make it look like a mix-up." Heather wheeled around, red-faced. "You're a trainee. You don't know protocol." Zoe shook her head. "I know right from wrong. And this is wrong." Captain Eli opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Vanessa yelled over him, "Shut it, Captain. We've all heard the audio. We've all seen how you treated him." Patrick raised his phone higher. "My video just hit 2 million views. The world's watching now. #StarGlideShock is trending." Eli's lips curled in frustration, realizing he was no longer in control of the narrative or the cabin. Then came the final crack in their armor. Rachel's voice came through Julian's earpiece again, firm and decisive. "James says it's time. Sarah and David are backing full executive authority. You are cleared to act." Julian took a slow step forward, facing Heather, Troy, Captain Eli, and Natalie, the 4 who had spent the last 20 minutes unraveling the dignity of an innocent man based on his clothes, his skin, and their unchecked bias. But he didn't speak to them just yet. He turned first to the passengers. "Thank you," he said, "not just for filming but for standing up, for not sitting back when it was easier to stay quiet." Then he looked to Zoe. "You showed more integrity in one day than some do in their whole career." Zoe nodded, tears quietly lining her eyes. Heather took a step back, sensing the shift, trying to salvage control. "Look, maybe we misjudged." "You didn't misjudge," Julian interrupted sharply. You chose to ignore my ID. You chose to tear up my boarding pass. You chose to erase my name from the log. You laughed about it. And now you're scrambling because the mask is off." Captain Eli tried to step in again. "Sir, we can escalate this to federal security." "You won't need to," Julian said, finally stepping fully into the aisle. "Because I am Julian Matthews, CEO and 25% shareholder of Starglide Air, and as of this moment, the board is aware of every second of this incident." The air went completely still. Heather's mouth dropped open. Troy stuttered, "You're lying." Julian didn't flinch. "Rachel," patching James on speaker, "let a calm, authoritative male voice fill the cabin from Julian's phone. This is James Thompson, Starglide board member. We've received full recordings from Julian Matthews and the staff member Zoe Tran. The situation is being handled internally. Any Starglide employee who attempts to interfere further will be terminated." Natalie staggered back as if she'd been hit. Troy looked like he might throw up. Captain Eli's voice dropped to a whisper. "Oh my God," Vanessa gasped. "I knew it. I freaking knew it." Patrick laughed, both stunned and impressed. "Holy hell. That's the CEO." Heather finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Julian, I didn't know." Julian turned his gaze toward her. Calm, cold, and heavy. "That was the point. You didn't see me. You saw your version of me. And you decided I didn't deserve to sit in a seat I paid for on a plane I partly own." He turned to Natalie. You can still fix this. You can make the right call. But you've got to make it now. Natalie swallowed hard, then slowly stepped back. I'm not touching him. She lowered her hand from her radio. I want no part of this mess. Passengers clapped. Not loud, but enough to shift the weight of the room. Captain Eli stood frozen, Heather in shock, Troy leaning against the galley wall as if he were sinking. Julian lifted his phone again. Rachel, tell the board we'll be proceeding with crew terminations before takeoff. Replacement crew should be ready at the gate in 10. Rachel replied. Confirmed. Heather whispered. Please, Julian, this was a mistake. No. Julian replied, cool and final. This was a pattern, and now that pattern ends. The cabin didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It was quiet, charged, settled. The fight was over. Now came the consequences. Julian Matthews stood in the aisle of Starglide Flight 716 like he had just taken back the reins of a runaway train. His voice steady, his posture calm, but his presence now undeniable. Let's make this official. He said loud enough for everyone in the first-class cabin to hear. My name is Julian Matthews. I'm the CEO of Starglide Air and a 25% shareholder of this company. What just happened on this aircraft is not only a violation of our code of conduct, it's a direct insult to every value we claim to uphold. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by stunned, reverent silence. Heather staggered back as if slapped, her hand covering her mouth. Troy's arms dropped to his sides, the smug grin long gone, replaced with a blank stare as if his brain had blue-screened. Captain Eli Ford looked like someone had ripped his name off his pilot badge. Wait, Eli said, finally speaking, his voice cracking. You're Julian Matthews. The same, Julian replied flatly, and unless you want security escorting you off this aircraft in front of a growing crowd of recording passengers, I suggest you cooperate. Natalie, who had been shifting uncomfortably since Julian dropped the truth, didn't say a word. She simply took a step back from the aisle and crossed her arms. I'm not stopping this, she muttered. I'm done. Vanessa covered her mouth in disbelief, her phone still rolling. Oh my God. I knew something was off. He was too calm, too confident. Patrick said, You ever seen somebody walk into a lion's den with that much patience? That was a boss move. Literally. Julian turned toward his AirPods again. Rachel, where are we with the board? Rachel responded in real time, her voice playing clearly on speaker. James, Sarah, and David are all in agreement. Terminations approved. Emergency Protocol 17A is in effect. You have full authority to proceed. Heather dropped into the jump seat, eyes wide, chest rising and falling like she'd just run a mile. Please? I didn't know who you were. Julian tilted his head, not unkind but completely unimpressed. That's the problem. You don't treat people with respect unless you think they're somebody. That's not how this airline runs. Not anymore. Troy tried to chime in, hands open, pleading. Look man, it wasn't personal. Stop talking, Julian said without turning. You had multiple chances to check the system. You mocked my card. You laughed at my name. You stood by while Heather tore up a valid boarding pass and fabricated a seating record. That's not just bias. That's corruption. He turned to Captain Eli last, locking eyes. And you, the highest authority on this plane, backed it all without question, without proof. You overrode policy to satisfy a VIP couple because you assumed someone like me couldn't possibly belong here. Eli looked down. I made a judgment call. No, Julian corrected. You made a biased call. And now you're grounded. Rachel's voice came through again. Replacement crew arriving at gate A26 in 7 minutes. Ground manager has been informed. Please proceed with escort. Julian stepped back slightly, giving Heather, Troy, and Eli space to exit. You are all relieved of duty permanently. You'll be escorted off this aircraft immediately. You are not to return to Starglide Air property unless contacted by legal. Heather looked like she might faint. You can't just. Julian. Rachel, please confirm their employee IDs are flagged. Rachel responded. Confirmed. Terminated. System updated. Troy exhaled sharply and muttered, "Damn." Eli, still pale, stood stiffly. "Captain's log will reflect full incident." "Don't worry," Julian said. "So will mine, and mine carries more weight." A few scattered claps broke out in the cabin, then a few more, and before long, a round of applause rose up. Not the thunderous kind, but a steady, heartfelt rhythm from passengers who had seen enough and were ready to exhale. Vanessa smiled and whispered, "That's justice." Patrick added, "That's leadership," as the terminated crew members slowly began gathering their things, escorted down the aisle by two newly arrived gate managers. Julian turned to Natalie. "You had a choice, and you hesitated, but you didn't push it too far." Natalie nodded slowly, almost like she wasn't sure she deserved his mercy. "I got caught up in it. I'm not proud." "You'll be retrained," Julian said. "You'll be assigned to a different base for a while. You get one shot to prove you belong on this team." Natalie didn't cry, but her eyes watered. "Thank you, sir." Zoe stood quietly off to the side, still gripping her phone, unsure what to do now. Julian walked over to her and extended his hand. "You're getting promoted, effective immediately. Starglide doesn't need more bodies. We need integrity, and you've shown more courage in one flight than most see in a whole career." Zoe's eyes widened, stunned. Seriously," he said with a nod. "We'll get you a badge and wings today." More clapping. Some passengers stood. One even called out, "Finally, someone who gives a damn." Rachel chimed in once more. "Board has confirmed full support for your decisions. Crew retraining and policy audits begin immediately. David Lee will oversee compliance. Compensation is being issued to affected passengers." Julian gave a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Rachel. Keep me updated." Then turning to the passengers, he raised his voice gently. "I want to thank all of you for your patience, for recording, for speaking up. This flight will be delayed, but it will fly, and the people on board will be treated with the dignity they deserve." Vanessa wiped her eyes. "You've changed this airline tonight." Patrick grinned. "This is going to be in every news cycle by tomorrow." Julian shrugged. "Let it be. Sometimes the truth needs airtime." A few rows down, an elderly couple gave Julian a quiet nod. Another woman said, "My son has been through this. Thank you for not backing down." Julian looked around and said, "No one should have to look like money to be treated like a person." And with that, he took his place in seat 2A, where he belonged from the beginning. This time, no one questioned it, no one challenged it, and no one dared. 10 minutes later, the air in the terminal outside Gate 26 felt just as tense as the cabin had been. Except now the fired crew stood under fluorescent airport lights, stripped of their titles, holding their carry-outs like civilians. Julian Matthews stepped off the plane, briefly flanked by two board-authorized security officers and Rachel on a live call through his AirPods. Heather stood rigid, mascara streaking beneath her eyes, whispering again and again that she hadn't known, that it was just a misunderstanding. "You knew what you were doing," Julian said, his voice even but laced with finality. "You didn't need to know who I was. All you had to know was that I was a human being who paid for a seat and showed valid ID." Troy stood beside her, arms crossed. No more jokes left in him, just a blank stare and a sagging posture. "You're done," Julian continued. "Your employee records have been closed. You will receive no severance. Your access is revoked." Rachel added in his ear, "Confirmed. Systems updated. They're locked out." Then came Captain Eli Ford, once the highest authority in the aircraft, now no more than a man in uniform who had forgotten that leadership begins with listening. "I served 23 years, he muttered. "Then you should have known better," Julian replied sharply. "And that makes this even worse." Security officers motioned for them toward the terminal exit. Heather looked back, hollow. Troy didn't. Eli didn't either. Julian didn't flinch. As they disappeared into the crowd, Julian turned back toward the gate area where Natalie Cruz stood by the wall, her eyes heavy but clear. She stepped forward cautiously. unsure whether to speak. "You gave me a choice," she said softly. "And I almost blew it." Julian didn't interrupt. He let her feel the weight of her words. "I didn't pull him out, but I didn't stand up either, and that's going to sit with me for a long time." Julian gave a small nod. "We've all stood on the wrong side of something. What matters is what we do next." Natalie straightened. "I'll do better. I want to learn. Then you'll start retraining next week," he said. "You'll report to a different base, and you'll shadow Zoe Tran." Natalie blinked, surprised. "Zoe," Julian smiled. "She just got promoted." Back at the gate, Zoe stood by the door in disbelief. Badge freshly issued. Cheeks flushed as fellow crew members congratulated her. A manager handed her official wings. She stared down at them like they might disappear if she blinked. Julian approached her and held out his hand. "You kept your head down when they told you to stay quiet, but you spoke anyway. You trusted what was right. That takes courage." She stammered. "I couldn't watch it happen. Not again." Julian nodded. "And now you'll help lead change." Then Rachel's voice returned in his ear. "Julian, we've got something." Troy just admitted in his exit interview that this isn't the first time. He, Heather, and Eli covered up at least 3 prior complaints, all buried by altering logs. Julian's jaw tensed. "Where 2 in Los Angeles, 1 in Phoenix, all minority passengers, all assigned first class. Records tampered to downgrade or remove them. This is bigger than bias." Julian muttered. "This is systematic deception." Rachel continued. "David Lee already ordered a full audit. Starting today, Sarah's putting out a public statement. James wants to brief the DOJ by morning." Julian turned toward the window, watching planes pull in and out on the tarmac, each one carrying people who trust they'd be treated fairly, no matter what they wore or where they came from. "Then let's clean house," he said. "From the top down." He walked back toward the gate where passengers, now to board temporarily during the crew switch, waited patiently, many of them still shaken. Some applauded softly as he approached. One woman stood and said, "You didn't have to come yourself, but you did." Another added, "You could have let PR handle it, but you stood in it." Julian gave a humble nod. That's what leadership is. Not hiding behind statements, but showing up in the hard moments. Zoe stood beside him now, wings pinned. Natalie off to the side, silently observing. Rachel reported, "New crew is briefed and boarding. Flight can resume in 15. Julian looked around one last time. "Make sure every passenger affected today receives a direct apology, full refund, and lifetime platinum status. No exceptions." "On it," Rachel replied. "Already processing." Zoe added, "Set her up with mentorship under our DEI lead. She's going far." Zoe's eyes went wide again. Seriously," Julian said with a smile. "This company needs more of you." Then he turned to Natalie. "You'll be shadowing her. Learn from the voice you tried to ignore." Natalie nodded. "I will." Rachel chimed in once more. Julian trending update. #StarglightShock just crossed 75,000 views. Media's asking for a statement. "Let them watch," he said. "We're not going viral. We're going accountable." He stepped back into the jet bridge, ready to reboard. Not just the plane, but a new era for the airline he helped build. Not through press releases or social media spin, but through action, consequences, and redemption, all before takeoff.